And we're back. Hello, Rose.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning again.
Yeah. So, we are just beginning our consideration of early Hasidism. And we talked about last week the fact that every Hasidic group has certain things in common. And the first common denominator is they lay claim to the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov, right? They may vary a little bit from his practice, but they certainly claim to be the disciples and to have the correct interpretation of the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, at least for their time, right? So now we're going to look today at some of the other areas of common ground between different Hasidic groups. One of them is the importance of the tzaddik. Who is the tzaddik? Well, tzaddik means righteous person, right? But the tzaddik, in this case, is the leader of a Hasidic group, known as the Rabbi, right? There's a big difference between a rabbi and a Rebbe, okay? In Hasidic culture, typically the Rebbe gives people a lot of direction. It varies in different groups, but the Rebbe gives a lot of very personal direction, sometimes to the extent of this is how you should make a living, this is what you need to be learning, etc. Right? When I was in my congregation in Kansas City, I had a congregant who would occasionally address me as Rebbe. And after about the fourth or fifth time she did this, I said to her, you realize what this means? You know, if I'm going to be your Rebbe, you have to do what I tell you to do. Never heard that from her afterwards. I took care of that problem. And in most Hasidic groups, you actually do have the right to say no to the Rebbe. But you would really think not just twice, but 5 and 6 times before saying no to the Rebbe. Because first of all, the Rebbe is the charismatic leader of the group, right? He's the leader for a reason. And in a way, the Rebbe is your link to the higher world, right? You know, most of us, we have a little bit of difficulty having a direct link with God, right? The Rebbe doesn't have that problem, right? We understand, you know, if we're Hasidim, we understand that the Rebbe has that kind of connection just because of who he is and what he is and what he knows, right? And so if you can't connect directly to the higher realms, you can do the next best thing. You can connect with the Rebbe. You know, it's like completing an electrical circuit. And if the Rebbe's connected to God and you're connected to the Rebbe, well, that's not bad, right? Karen, you have a question or a comment.
When did that term Rebbe come into existence? When did that start?
I'm not sure. I think probably in the 18th century.
And was it an intentional choice to separate from a traditional rabbi? Was that why?
I don't know the answer to that, Karen. It
Okay,
might
thank you.
it might well have just developed organically rather than being a conscious choice.
Uh-huh, thanks.
Yes, Daniel.
So the Rebbe is the Rebbe of a small community, a synagogue, a yeshiva, all of the above,
No,
or
the Rebbe is the Rebbe for a whole group. The group might have one synagogue or it might have 100.
so it's the community.
Mhm. But
And
it's
he,
not but community not defined as one geographic place. Your Rebbe might live in Israel, right? And you're in Houston.
okay. So that's it's like in the Lubavitch movement, they have the inherited Schneerson thing.
Yeah,
And that's what you're talking about. Biggest guy in the group, there's only one.
that's right.
Okay.
And by the way, most Hasidic groups are not specifically very messianic. Chabad did become messianic. We'll talk about that somewhere down the road. But for most groups, the attitude is, no, the Mashiach hasn't come. But if there were anyone who could be the Mashiach today, it would be the Rebbe. It would be my Rebbe as opposed to somebody else's Rebbe. Because if the Rebbe of somebody else were greater than your Rebbe, why would you stay with a lesser Rebbe, right? So sometimes being part of a particular Hasidic group became geographical, and sometimes it was very spiritual. Yes,
So
Karen.
the term Rav is
Hold
simply.
on a second. Karen,
Sorry.
did you have a question? Oh, okay.
No, I'm sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Yeah, okay. Daniel.
So the term Rav is simply a rabbi, and it's analogous with what we call a rabbi.
Yes,
It's not anything to do with being a Rebbe.
correct.
I didn't know that. That's a big mistake I've been making. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Rebbe is this charismatic leader for a group of Hasidim. And very often in early Hasidism, we see that the Rebbes are associated with stories about miracles, wonder working, because they're able to go into the higher realms and fix problems that exist up there that are causing problems down here with us. Right? The tzaddik he's not a messiah figure, but he's a big deal. Right? Now there were obviously charismatic leaders in messianic movements, but here it becomes kind of an ongoing phenomenon. It's not centered just around one person, at least not after the Baal Shem Tov. It's it becomes a common phenomenon throughout Eastern Europe. Most mainstream rabbinic scholars, you didn't see them much. They were busy studying Torah most of the time. And, they didn't visit with people. They didn't pastor people as rabbis do today. The Rebbe is definitely a pastor. The Rebbe is definitely somebody who is in touch with his followers and is able to connect with them and inspire them. If you're one of the mainstream rabbis, well, you wouldn't typically teach the average person. You would teach, an elite of students and train the next generation of rebbes. But you were of rabbis, but you were not someone who spent a lot of time with the average Jew. In many ways, the Hasidic Rebbe is a forerunner of the modern congregational rabbi, as someone who is pastor, as someone who is, who plays an almost mystical role for some people if they are so inclined. And many of them are, in my experience. And think about it for a second. I mean, most of us don't think of, rabbis as having special powers, but pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, if you have to have a procedure done in the hospital and it's kind of serious, and you want the rabbi to come and pray with you the day before your surgery, who would you like to come and pray with you? Would you like for rabbi number 10 in the community to come and pray with you? Or would you like the senior rabbi of your congregation to come and pray with you? Right? Most people, if the senior rabbi didn't come, it's like, I'm not getting the help that I need. No, if he doesn't care about me enough, then, who's going to intervene for me up there? Who's going to pray for me up there? Now, again, we're not superstitious, Kanai Nahara, right? But this happens more frequently than you might think. And it's really important for rabbis to be aware of it, and for us to be aware of what's going on inside us too, when we think in those ways, or when we're in a crisis like that. Right? But boy, if I don't want him to send the assistant rabbi to come pray with me. That's an inferior flavor, right? I want the Rebbe. I want the rabbi whose prayer is going to be heard and acted upon, and I'll go with absolute confidence into the surgery, knowing that I will be well, Kanai Nahara, for another 30 years. Okay? So, we still think a little bit in those terms. In the 18th century, I assure you, the average Jew thought about it that way all the time. Almost everyone did. Okay? You might acknowledge that, yes, the Rebbe is also a human being, but sometimes that's very difficult to imagine, that someone of such charisma and such power is just a normal person with normal functions. I read a story of someone who was visiting at 770 Eastern Parkway, because he was, that's the Grand Central Chabad in Brooklyn. And this person was waiting to have a meeting with somebody else, and he happened to be sitting in a hallway adjacent to the men's room, and he heard the Rebbe from inside the men's room groaning. Right? Yeah, happens. Right? This person lost his faith. He couldn't imagine the Rebbe having the kind of physical problems that a normal person might, just normal aches and pains, right? Couldn't imagine it. Lost his faith. Can happen quickly. So watch out if you have that kind of faith. The tzaddik has a lot of authority, right? The Baal Shem Tov said that he got his from his heavenly teacher, right? But along with authority comes a ton of responsibility. The the Hasidic Rebbe, he has all this on his shoulders that he's got to be able to intercede for his people on the highest level. Right? He's very involved in the public affairs of the Jewish community. He does Kabbalistic rituals, just like, the Baal Shem Tov, who wrote amulets and prayed for people's healing. It's as if he has a direct line to God. And that is how many of his people will think of him. But and in fact, the tzaddik, if you think of the 10 sfirot in Kabbalah, the tzaddik is associated with the sfira yesod. Why? Because there's a verse in Proverbs that says, tzaddik yesod olam. The righteous is the foundation of the world. But here, it means not only what it says, it means that the world cannot exist without the tzaddik. And you yourself, if your existence is in question, you better latch on to the tzaddik, because he's going to be the one who will keep you in this world. Right? So the tzaddik, both Kabbalistically and charismatically, links people from the upper world down here, right? And that is, to some degree, a way for people to feel closer to God. If you have trouble feeling closer to God, get closer to somebody who's close to God. And that's how it works. Yes, Lou.
The tzaddik is not a lamed bavnik, right?
No, what Lou is referring to is the legend that there are 36 righteous people on whom the world, by whose merit the world is sustained. So theoretically, the tzaddik could be one of the 36, but generally the legend of the 36 righteous people involves people who are not known as such, right? They're the hidden righteous people. So your Rebbe is a tzaddik, but he wouldn't fit the qualifications because he's too public to be one of the 36. Okay, so the role, Daniel.
If a Rebbe were to tell his followers, you shall follow all CDC guidelines in reference to COVID, they would all just do it, wouldn't they?
Absolutely.
So if they don't, it's really kind of, he's accountable, or he should be.
Yeah, well, a Rebbe or any charismatic leader who moves his group in the wrong direction is generally considered reprehensible, right? Now,
thank you.
Let's, I'll give you a more political example. When Jews were dealing with the impact of the Napoleonic Wars in Eastern Europe, let's say around 1800, 1810, all right? People come to the Rebbe and they say, who should we support? Should we support the Tsar or Napoleon? And people did what their Rebbe told them to do. Right? Some Rebbes said, well, Napoleon is going to be better for the Jews. And so we're going to root for and support Napoleon. Other Rebbes, including the first Chabad Rebbe, Schneur Zalman of Liadi, said, we're going to support the czar. The devil you know is better than the one you don't. And under the czar, there will still be discrimination against Jews, but Jews will be loyal to Judaism. Not necessarily true under Napoleon. So, and generally, people listened to their Rebbe. Okay, so, yeah, Daniel?
I'm sorry, I forgot to turn it off. I'll
Okay,
turn it
okay,
off.
all right. Yeah, you guys are being very good about using the raise hand feature. That's excellent. Because I may actually notice that from time to time. Okay, so here in text number 2, teaching of Jacob Joseph Bulanoia, where he's really quoting what the Baal Shem Tov teaches. Okay, the Baal Shem Tov never wrote any books. Whatever he said, we only know from collections of his teachings that were written down by other people. And Yaakov Yosef, Jacob Joseph, was one of the key people who wrote down these teachings. And he was someone who was sort of converted to Hasidism by the Baal Shem Tov, much like this story with Dov Ber. So he quotes this teaching from Pirkei Avot. There were 10 generations from Adam to Noah to indicate how forgiving God was. Right? So what does the Baal Shem Tov say about this? All the 10 generations caused him anger, but they were not punished until the generation of Noah. And God would still have forgiven them, but Noah is the one who made God angry. Now, this is not normally how we think of Noah, right? Noah was the one righteous person, right? That's why he survived. So God brought the flood upon them because of Noah. Why? God tells Noah, you didn't go out to save your people, to purify them, to teach them how to serve their creator. You locked yourself in your house. And we all know that Abraham didn't do that. Right? Therefore, you shall be locked up in the ark where you will suffer. You were not a shepherd to your people, sometimes going without sleep in an effort to reach them, to help them and raise them. Therefore, you shall now be a shepherd to the animals. And in the work of caring for them, sleep shall vanish from your eyes. All right. So it doesn't matter whether you agree with this interpretation of the Torah. The Torah is being read not as like, the capital T truth, but as a way of commenting on current affairs. And what are the current affairs in the time of the Baal Shem Tov? The rabbis are separated from the people. They do not go out to the people and try to teach them individually. In a way, they're afraid of being dragged down by the people. Right? It's a distraction from Torah study more than anything else, right? So these people are not out there for the average Jew, and in fact, very often they have contempt for the average Jew. And that's the way Dov Ber was before his conversion. Right? So the tzaddik is the person who has to bring the people back. He has to be willing to go out to the people and bring them together with God. Now, yeah, it could work the other way. Instead of him bringing them up, they might bring him down. That's the chance you got to take. You have to be willing to go out to the people. Okay? And bring them back to God. That's the way of the tzaddik. Now, a little more about Jacob Joseph, Yaakov Yosef. Yaakov Yosef was originally very ascetic, very much apart from the world, like many of the mainstream rabbinic leaders. And the Baal Shem Tov took him aside and said, don't do any of that stuff anymore. No more of that fasting any more than the law requires, right? Just, meditate in certain ways, and they will bring you into contact with God, right? In other words, he's converting him to a different way of being Jewish, right? So that's what Hasidism tried to do for the vast majority of people, right? And in fact, the tzaddik, if he doesn't go out to the people, he's not really a tzaddik. He's an unfinished tzaddik. And that's the theme of this next little brief teaching, right? Which says, the tzaddikim are the first two letters of the divine name, and the common people are the last two letters. In other words, God's name needs both the tzaddik and the common people, right? If you don't have the right relationship between them, then you cannot unify God's name. Now in Kabbalah, remember, that's the essential thing. Now you have to unify the Sfirot, the Yud He, and the Vav He from below, and bring them together so that they, the divine flow from the higher levels flows down through the Sfirot to this world. And that only happens if the Yud He and the Vav He are combined, or we might say if Tiferet and Shekhinah are able to mate and to unify, right? And again, it doesn't matter where the tzaddik lives. He could be on your block. He could be on the other side of the globe, right? But he is your link to the higher realms, right? And by the way, this idea has taken hold a little bit in some of the non-Orthodox Haredi world, where, there is one charismatic leader, one righteous leader. He doesn't practice Hasidism, but people look up to him the same way that, and connect with him in the same way that Hasidim connect with their Rebbe. One more thing worth noting, and that is, there's more than one tzaddik, right? There's a tzaddik that's right for you, and there might be a different tzaddik that's right for me. In other words, one tzaddik may have a particular affinity to your soul, and that's why that guy is your Rebbe. Me, maybe I connect to this person's soul, and I'm his Rebbe. But I may not be able to be the Rebbe for everybody else, and that's why you need all these different tzaddikim living in different places, serving in different ways, emphasizing different aspects of Hasidism, as we'll see as we go forward. All right? So now we have two common denominators. One is the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov. Number two, the role of the tzaddik. Every Hasidic group has a tzaddik. The third common denominator, everything is unified. Right? That's reality. Everything is connected with God. And in fact, ultimately, there is only God. Right? And mystical awareness and mystical contemplation is supposed to help you come to understand this reality, that there is ultimately only God. The teaching in the Zohar says, Leit atar panui mine, that there is nothing that is devoid of God. So that's, a little farther along than just saying, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This says everything is one. Everything is part of God, right? I mentioned in my book this comment of Hillel Zeitlin, who was a 20th century mystic, who said, the God of the Baal Shem Tov is one that lives, strives, grows, blossoms, suffers and composes, thinks and creates that for which the heart is torn and the soul longs. The God of the Baal Shem Tov is in man, even in his lacks and sufferings, his sin and smallness. Okay, comments or questions up to here? Okay, well, let's go on to number 4, right? This is a teaching of Pinchas of Koretz, who was a contemporary of the Baal Shem Tov, actually not exactly a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, but certainly part of his circle, right? And well known for his own teachings and outlived the Baal Shem Tov by quite a large measure. So on the Shema, here is what he has to say. The term echad, which proclaims the unity of God, causes us to say there is nothing in the whole world other than the Holy One who fills the whole earth with his glory. So why do we say Shema? It is so that we should consider ourselves null and void and understand there is nothing to us but the soul within us, which is part of God above. Hence, there is nothing in the whole world except the one God. Our principal thought when reciting the word echad should be that the whole earth is full of his glory and there is nothing devoid of him. Right? So the whole earth is full of God's glory, which is a way of saying that God is accessible to us wherever we are. And that's something you hear a lot in Hasidic teaching. Yes, Daniel.
If God is everything in the world and there's evil in the world, then God contains evil.
Okay.
I don't think that's what they mean, though.
No. They deal, we've talked about how the mystical tradition deals with evil. And I think most Hasidic thinkers would agree that it comes from imbalances. That yes, there's the demonic in the world, but the demonic comes in because you don't keep things in the right proportion, right? You need love on the one hand, and you need boundaries on the other, right? And a good parent knows how to maintain both of those things, right? Otherwise, you get problems, right? Nobody's perfect at it except God. But we don't always manage that very well. And so that's how evil comes into the world. Right? There are other theories too, but that one will do. Okay? All right. Other comments or questions here? Okay, so not every one of the Hasidic masters would take this as far as Pinchas does. He says, saying Shema emphasizes that the whole material world is an illusion, right? Including me, right? God is one is a way of saying God is everything, right? And you can find God everywhere, and you should, right? And that's one reason why Hasidism appealed to the average Jew, because the stories and the parables that they used to illustrate this were taken from the language of the common and the experiences of the common Jew in Eastern Europe, right? And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on joy within faith because, if to be in God's presence, how joyful that would have to be, right? So Hasidic life should all, if you have that realization that everything is God, then why not be joyful? All right. And also God is a whole lot more accessible to you than the average king. Right? Now, yeah, what are the odds that you're going to go get to see the president? Right? Let alone the King of England. Not very good, right? Most of us are not going to have that privilege, right? But God is accessible all the time, 24/7. What a deal. Okay? So that made for much more joy for the average Jew living in Eastern Europe who might be poor, might be middle class, once in a while might be rich. But of course, even rich people back then didn't live as well as many poor people today do. Okay? So God's very accessible to us. Then we don't have to do all kinds of complicated things to be in touch with God. We don't have to do all those emaborate fasts. We don't have to have Lurianic Kabbalah with all of its mumbo jumbo and all the complicated practices that grew out of Lurianic prayer. The tzaddik just has to bring the power down, bring it down to our level, and we get to connect with it through the tzaddik, of course. Okay, and so the tzaddik winds up seeing a lot more than we do, but we get to see more because of him. Okay, so let's go to another teaching here. Text number 5 from Zev Wolf of Zhidomer, who said, "Do not see anything in the world as it appears, but raise your eyes to the heights," meaning the aspect of your contemplation and study to see only the divinity clothed in all things of the world, for there is nothing besides him, and there must be hidden holy sparks at all levels of being, granting them vitality. Okay, so some of you may remember that Lurianic Kabbalah gave birth to the idea of hidden holy sparks that are scattered about the universe. Right? Those sparks are things that you can see all around. Well, so here it's very personal. There are sparks that are out there for you. You have to redeem the spark that is intended for you. Right? So it's like you get a mission. You may not be aware of your mission, but you have a mission. And your mission is to raise up that spark. That's why you're here. Okay? And that helps to unify everything in the universe, everything within God. Interestingly, there were many of the early Hasidic rabbis went through a period of wandering, personal exile. They would wander from community to community. They would beg for support. And it was partly to identify with the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is in exile, right? But it's also partly to find whatever hidden spark was out there for them and to lift it up to its proper place. So here you are, all the things that you think are real, they're not real. And the things that are real are things that you can't normally apprehend. You only see them when either the Rebbe or God directly puts them in front of you. Okay? Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
If everything is the same in a certain aspect, to quote your book, does a rock have a soul? Does an animal have a soul? Just because everything in the universe was or is a creation of God, are they all equal?
It may have a soul, but it may be a much lower level of soul. And that's one of the things I have kind of steered away from in this class, because it gets really complicated when you start talking about different levels of soul. Mm-hmm. But even inanimate life is a part of God. And certainly animate life. Does it mean that you necessarily perceive God in them? Well, not unless you think of it in that way. Now, again, I'm not here to convince anyone of anything. This is just, how Hasidic thought works. Okay? Other comments or questions here? All right. Let's go to the next text. All right. Text number 6. It's a great teaching from a great book, one of the early Hasidic classics. It's called Sava'at HaRivash, which means the Testament of the Baal Shem Tov. Okay? It's not written by the Baal Shem Tov. It was just a collection of some of his insights, probably put together in broad outlines by Dov Ber, his successor, and edited by someone from the next generation of Hasidic rabbis. We're not positive who. But here's a great text. Starts out with this verse, and we've discussed this verse before, Shiviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. I have set God always before me. And he says Shiviti is associated with the concept of hishtavut, equanimity of all things. In other words, what is equanimity? Meaning that you're not affected too much by the events going on around you. It doesn't sway you from the way you think about yourself or the world around you. I like to describe it in terms of, my rabbinic life. Someone comes up to me after I give a sermon and says, Rabbi, that was the greatest sermon I've ever heard. It was so wonderful. You have to publish that. And what should I say? I say, thank you. Thank you for your feedback. I don't want to be too affected by that, right? And then, on the other hand, another person comes up to me and says, Rabbi, that was the most terrible sermon I've ever heard. It was disgusting. It was a disgrace. So what should I say? How should I respond? I should say, thank you for your feedback. Hishtavut is the ideal of being able to respond to different things with the same equanimity, not to be thrown by too much praise or too much criticism, because after all, you know who you are and you know what you are doing and you know something about God. Equanimity in all things, back to the text, so that whatever should happen to a person, he should consider it just the same, whether people praise him or insult him. Thus, with regard to food, whether it be delicacies or anything else, it's like, ribeye steak or meatloaf, right? Doesn't matter. Everything should be the same in his eyes. Since the Yetzer Hara, if he has hishtavut, the Yetzer Hara will be entirely removed from within him. And he will say about anything that happens, was it not sent from the blessed God? In God's eyes, it is fitting. And if he has equanimity, all of his intentions will be for the sake of heaven. From your own perspective, what happens will make no difference. This is a very high level. Right? So it's a great quality to have, and it's very heavily emphasized in Hasidism. There are all sorts of things that satisfy your ego, and they're very gratifying, spiritually or physically, doesn't matter. And Hasidic masters say, maybe humility a little bit is important, but even more than humility, hishtavut, this equanimity, that's a big, big quality. That's very
Confused who wrote this, Rabbi? Who wrote this one?
well, we don't know. Again, it's attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, so maybe, but we don't know. It's written long enough after the Baal Shem Tov to where, we don't have a direct line to say that he said it for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this verse, Shiviti Hashem lanegdi tamid, I have set God always before me. The way he understands the verse is everything is equal to me. Why? Because I put God before me. And if you always practice that, then the evil impulse will not control you. Right? And your intention will always be for God. You will always set God before you, right? And not yourself. Right? Okay, comments or questions here? Let's go to number 7, and this is going to bring us to the fourth thing that all the Hasidic groups have in common, which is the emphasis on devekut. Devekut, meaning cleaving to God, always having God in mind. So the Baal Shem Tov, or so it is reported, says it is a great achievement to keep in mind always that you are close to the Creator and that he surrounds you on all sides. As it is written, happy is the man who, when he thinks not of God, it is to him as a sin. This means that the instant you stop thinking about your devekut to God, you incur a sin. Right? By the way, this is a fairly creative translation of that verse. The New Jewish Translation has this verse as, happy the man whom the Lord does not hold guilty. Right? But the word Yachshov can mean, God considers him in a certain way, or that, you consider God. In other words, a person should always be thinking of God. You should always have this level of devekut, so that, if you lapse from it and for a few moments you're not thinking, you don't have God in mind, then that's a flaw, at least for you, right? And devekut should be a normal thing that you are always thinking about. You don't even have to try to get into that state. And it should be strong enough so that, when there are circumstances that might normally distract you, you would still have it. You would still maintain it. Okay? So this interpretation of this verse suggests that devekut is like the default relationship with God. And he says, our devekut to God should be such that we need not make a special mental effort each time to be aware of a feeling of nearness to him. We should perceive the Creator intellectually as the place of the world and man as a microcosm. Thus we fulfill the verse, I have set the Lord always before me. There's that verse again, right? Now, the place, Hamakom, is the name of God. The idea of God as Hamakom, as the place of the world, that's a mainstream rabbinic idea. So this is an extension of what we saw before. That the physical world is within God, but God is not limited to the physical world. God goes way beyond the physical world. So this is an idea that philosophers call panentheism, right? Pantheism is where God is identical to the cosmos. Panentheism means that God contains the physical world, but God is even more than that, right? So, if you believe that, then the natural next assumption is God is very close, right? Because if God is truly within, if the physical world is connected with God, then we're part of that. So that's great, and that's something that helps to sustain us and to give us the joy that Hasidism seeks to develop. Right? So there is, each person is considered, and they use this verse from the book of Job, Chelek Eloah Mima'al, a part of God from above. That's the human being. And if you accept that you are part of God from above, then it's natural for you to feel that you can have some sense of reunion with God, or even union with God, that you can connect with God and have this sense of dveikut on a constant basis. We've come to the end of our time for today. We're going to be on hiatus through Pesach, so wish everybody Chag Sameach, a good Yontif, and hopefully we'll see you all in 3 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank
Everybody.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.